What if your body wasn't just punished, but turned into a warning for every woman who dared to disobey? Deep beneath a medieval fortress in a chamber of stone and shadows stood a device so cruel, it spoke louder than any law or sermon. This wasn't justice. It was theater, a message carved into flesh, meant to silence generations. And if you want more of these buried truths, the stories history tried to hide, make sure to subscribe to Gory Archives, because only then will these voices of the past continue to reach you. One beneath the foundations of medieval fortresses, far below the sound of bells or the light of day, there existed rooms that were never meant to be spoken of. These were not storerooms or dungeons in the ordinary sense. They were theaters of suffering, carved into stone, sealed in shadows, and guarded not by soldiers but by silence itself. The air in these hidden chambers was thick with dampness, clinging to the skin like a second layer. The smell of rust lingered, sharp and metallic, as though the walls themselves were bleeding. Torches, their flames faint and dying, painted the stone in trembling amber light. It was here, in the half-light of secrecy, that one could find objects not of defense or survival, but of cruelty elevated to art. In one corner stood something that could easily deceive the eye. At first glance, it resembled armor, ornate, curved, almost regal in its presence. Its iron surface bore patterns and etchings, as though its creator took pride in the craft. To the unsuspecting, it might even have seemed beautiful, a relic meant for ceremony or battle. But this illusion withered the moment one understood its true design. The curves did not fit the body of a soldier. They were not shaped for the shoulders of men or the chest of warriors. Instead, every edge and every line was measured against the softness of the female form. This was not armor to protect. It was a shell to entrap, to suffocate, and to humiliate. An iron womb that gave no life, only agony. Those who entered its embrace did not die swiftly. That was never the intention. Death came slowly, stretched across hours or even days, each moment elongated by anticipation, by the crushing realization that the body had become both prison and stage. Within this chamber, suffering was not hidden. It was displayed. The cries of the captive became performance. Her gasps of pain became sermon. For the crowd that sometimes gathered, this was not justice. It was theater. The woman inside the device was no longer seen as human. She was a warning, her suffering a story carved into her flesh for others to read. Every scream was a reminder. Survival lay in silence, obedience, submission. To defy was to be unmade. The fortress walls absorbed these performances, keeping their echoes alive long after the torches burned out. The silence that followed was not peace. It was victory, not for the victim, but for those who had built this device and sanctioned its use. Men who believed themselves righteous, who cloaked cruelty in the robes of faith, order, and morality. But righteousness was only the mask. Beneath it was fear, the fear of losing control, the fear of women who might speak, resist, or refuse. So fear was forged into iron, given shape and weight, and used to script obedience into bodies. The chamber became a book, the body became the parchment, and pain was the ink with which power wrote its laws. This was the theater of suffering, a grotesque stage where faith and iron performed side by side, where screams became the music of control, and where silence eventually was the only applause. Remember this: the devices of the past were never only about punishing one person. They were designed to terrify everyone who witnessed them, to ensure obedience spread like a shadow. Power did not just punish, it performed. And it demanded that everyone else watch. At Gory Archives, we uncover these buried truths. The tools, the rituals, the cruelty that history tried to lock away in silence. We drag them back into the light. If you want to continue walking through these forgotten chambers with us, to see what was hidden behind the veil of faith and power, subscribe, because only through remembrance can silence be broken, and only by unearthing the past can its echoes finally be understood. The device was not built merely to restrain a body. It was engineered to transform a woman into a spectacle, to turn her agony into a script that others would read with terror. The architects of this cruelty knew one truth very well: fear spreads faster than fire. When the iron shell opened, it revealed a hollow carved with dreadful precision. Inside, the walls were not smooth. Hidden among the curves were spikes, some long, some short, some designed not to pierce organs swiftly but to press and prod, to wound without granting mercy. Each iron tooth was placed with intention, not to kill outright, but to create 1,000 small agonies. Imagine the moment of entrapment. The heavy doors creaked open, groaning like the voice of the fortress itself. The woman was forced forward, her feet dragging against the cold floor. Perhaps she resisted, clawing at the air, begging for forgiveness, or perhaps she fell silent, her voice stolen by dread long before the device touched her skin. Guards, priests, or executioners, men who wore the mask of righteousness, pushed her inside. Her body fit too perfectly, as though the iron womb had been waiting for her all along. When the doors began to close, the spikes pressed into her flesh. Not enough to kill, not yet, but enough to remind her that every breath she took would be a bargain with pain. The final sound was the clang of iron meeting iron, echoing like a bell of damnation. From that moment, she no longer belonged to herself. She belonged to the device, to the chamber, and most of all to the audience, because yes, there was always an audience. They gathered not out of necessity, but out of hunger. Some came to reassure themselves that they were safe as long as they obeyed. Others came out of curiosity, eager to see what defiance looked like when it was broken. Children clung to their mothers' skirts. Men crossed their arms as though they were protectors of divine order. And priests whispered prayers that sounded less like blessings and more like declarations of power. Every scream that escaped the iron shell was met with silence. Not because it went unheard, but because it was forbidden to answer. Compassion was a crime in such places. To feel pity was to challenge the system. So the crowd stared, their silence louder than any cheer. Inside, hours turned into an eternity. The spikes bruised, cut, and pierced, but always in ways that prolonged suffering. Some were placed to dig into the skin of the arms, forcing the muscles to tremble with exhaustion. Others pressed against the legs, ensuring that standing became torment, yet collapsing brought no relief. The body was caught between agony and suffocation, each moment an unbearable choice. The iron coffin did not just wound, it stole dignity. The victim could not move with grace, could not cry without being overheard, could not even breathe without reminding herself that she was on display. Her body became a message. Obedience is survival, resistance is ruin. The audience did not need to be told the lesson. They understood it with every shudder, every muffled cry, every drop of blood that darkened the edges of the device. Power did not lecture, it demonstrated, and its demonstration was always merciless. As the hours stretched, the woman's voice grew hoarse. Her cries turned to whimpers, then to silence. But that silence was not freedom. It was the silence of exhaustion, of defeat. For the crowd, this was the most powerful moment of all. Silence meant the performance was complete. Silence meant obedience had been carved into every watching heart. In truth, the device killed not just the woman inside it, but a part of every witness who left the chamber. The fear lodged itself in their minds, ensuring obedience long after the iron coffin was empty. This was why the performance mattered more than the execution. Death was inevitable, but fear could last for generations. And so the device stood as both instrument and actor. A grotesque stage prop in the theater of authority. Crafted by blacksmiths, sanctioned by priests, enforced by rulers, it embodied an entire system of control. Its iron jaws spoke the language of power more clearly than any sermon ever could. The fortress above might have symbolized protection and order, but below in the chamber of silence, true authority was revealed. An authority built not on justice, but on terror. History records kings, queens, and battles, yet it so often forgets the cries that echoed in places like this. But those cries mattered. They shaped behavior, molded communities, and silenced voices before they were ever raised. This is why Gory Archives exists, to remind us that history is not just crowns and conquests. It is also iron and fire, silence and fear. It is the hidden machinery of control that governed lives in ways rarely spoken of. Subscribe and continue with us into the next descent, because the past is not only written in books, it is carved in wounds, preserved in devices, and buried in chambers that demand to be remembered. The chamber did not end with death. It ended with silence. A silence so heavy, so absolute that it seemed to stain the stones themselves. When the iron doors were finally pried open, the body that remained inside was more than a corpse. It was a testimony. Every bruise, every puncture, every trickle of dried blood told a story that words could never capture. But the cruelty was not finished there. For the true purpose of such a device was never just to kill, it was to remind. The body would sometimes be displayed, carried out into the open courtyards where daylight struck what had been hidden underground. The message was clear. No wall, no prayer, no rebellion could shield anyone from the reach of iron. In those moments, the people of the fortress learned more than any law could teach. They saw that justice, as their rulers called it, was not a matter of fairness, it was a weapon. One that punished not only the guilty, but anyone bold enough to dream of resistance. The Iron Maiden, or the Coffin of Spikes, stood as the perfect emblem of a world where fear was the true monarch. Yet fear has a strange afterlife. It lingers long after its instruments are gone. Generations later, the fortress remains, its stones weathered, its towers still rising against the sky. Tourists walk the paths, children play in the courtyards, and guides speak of kings and battles. But beneath the cobblestones, in the hidden corners, the air still carries whispers. Not everyone can hear them, but some swear that in the dead of night, if you listen closely, the echoes return. The creak of iron hinges, the muffled cries, the final silence. And history, ever selective, rarely tells these stories. It prefers the triumph of rulers, the glory of wars, the legacy of crowns. The hidden tortures, the silenced voices, are dismissed as rumors, as exaggerations, as shadows best forgotten. Yet shadows tell their own truth. What does it mean that such devices existed? That humans built them, sanctioned them, and used them not just once, but many times. It means that cruelty was not an accident. It was a craft. It was deliberate, refined, perfected. It means that suffering was not simply a byproduct of power. It was one of its tools. And perhaps that is why we must remember. The iron coffin may no longer stand in its chamber. The spikes may have rusted, the doors collapsed, the fortress renovated into something more palatable for modern eyes. But memory does not need metal. Memory survives in words, in whispers, in the unease that creeps into the soul when one stands in places that once knew too much pain. Forgetting is easy. It comforts us to believe that such cruelties belonged only to a darker, primitive age. But history does not vanish when we look away. The past is patient, it waits. And when we uncover it, when we dare to look into its face, it forces us to ask, how far have we really come? Because if we forget, if we allow the screams of the past to be buried under the stones of castles and the polish of tourist attractions, then we risk repeating what we claim to despise. The device may change shape, the fortress may take a different form, but the hunger for power through fear has always been part of humanity's shadow, and that is why this story must be told. Not as spectacle, but as warning. Not as entertainment, but as remembrance. The woman in the iron coffin is nameless now. No records carry her voice, no chronicle preserves her face, but her silence echoes louder than the sermons of kings. Her suffering is not a mere tale of cruelty. It is the foundation of a truth we must not ignore. That power, when unchecked, always seeks to crush. That fear, when sanctified, always seeks to enslave. We tell these stories so that shadows cannot fully reclaim them. And so, as we close this chapter of hidden history, know this: the fortress still stands, the stones still breathe, and the past still lingers. It lingers in us, as a reminder of what was done and what must never be done again. This is the mission of Gory Archives: to unearth what was buried, to bring light to what was concealed, to ensure that silence never wins. Subscribe to Gory Archives and walk with us deeper into the corridors of forgotten history. Because only by facing the past can we ever hope to change the future.